And I want to welcome everybody to this online conversation tonight. Dobry večer. My name is Jen Budney, and I am the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. And we are really thrilled tonight to be hosting an online lecture by Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk, Lest They Forget, a reflection on the redress movement for Canada's first national internment operations of 1914 to 1920. The Ukrainian Museum of Canada was founded in 1936 by the Ukrainian Women's Association of Canada, and we're situated in Treaty 6 territory. The first Ukrainians to come to the prairies came as treaty people by virtue of having arrived here about 20 years after the early treaties were signed. But it's important for us to acknowledge that Ukrainians were, even if unwittingly, part of the colonial effort to displace Indigenous people from their lands, sometimes with great violence. Indeed, General William Otter, who organized Canada's first national internment operations, had 20 years earlier led, 20 years before the Ukrainians came, and about 40 years before World War I, had led the Canadian forces against Chiefs Poundmaker and Fine Day in the Battle of Cutknife here in Saskatchewan. So the violence that so many Ukrainians experienced at the hands of the Canadian government during World War I came from the same impulses that had earlier led to the disenfranchisement of the original inhabitants of this land. And for me, it was very important to make this connection tonight. And I hope that an understanding of this connection can help build empathy across our communities as we continue to work for reparations, for Indigenous communities, and for reconciliation. The talk that we are here for tonight coincides with the museum's presentation of the exhibition Enemy Aliens, Internment in Canada, 1914 to 1920, which is running at the Ukrainian Museum of Canada until May 11th, 2024. We had the opening just over a week ago, and about 100 people were in attendance that night. This exhibition features 33 photos from the Canadian War Museum, Library and Archives Canada, and many university archival and private collections throughout the country. It was developed by the Canadian War Museum in partnership with the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation, and it's part of the ongoing efforts to educate the Canadian public about a moment in history that still too few people know about. Nobody, absolutely nobody, has been more active in this project of education than our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk. And it's my honor to introduce Dr. Luciuk now. Dr. Luciuk is a distinguished scholar and educator who holds the position of full professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and is a fellow at the University of Toronto. He's not only an accomplished academic, but also an acclaimed author. He has 24 books, by my count, under his name, and his work has shed light on pivotal historical narratives, both here and in Ukraine. Dr. Luciuk's talk tonight promises to be enlightening, drawing from his intimate personal experience with the redress movement. As a founding member of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, he has championed civil rights and historical remembrance. His efforts have been recognized on a national scale, earning him Ukraine's Cross of Ivan Mazepa in 2019. Moreover, Dr. Luciuk's public service is exemplary. He served as a distinguished appointee to both the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada and the Parole Board of Canada. His longstanding involvement with the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund reflects his passion for justice and commemoration. I will not read out a list of all of those publications that he has, but he does have a new one published in 2023, which covers some of the material that we're going to be hearing about tonight. In fact, it's called Lest They Forget. And at the end of this talk, we'll tell you how to order this book, because of course, our lecture tonight will only be able to give you a little taste of everything that's in the book. If you are like me and you have questions during the presentation, please hold on to those questions. You can write them down with a pen and paper in front of you and save them to the end of the talk, or you can type them into the chat box on the Zoom call and we will read them out when the talk is done. For now, I want to warmly welcome Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk and thank him for agreeing to do this talk for us tonight. And now, Lubomyr, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Budny. Thank you all for attending this evening, and thank you to the Ukrainian Museum of Saskatchewan for inviting me to speak to you tonight via Zoom. I remember with some fondness being in the museum a number of years ago when the phone rang and Governor General Natishin to-be was consulting with the museum on what his regal crest would be. And I was actually able to consult on a phone and say, why don't you put a trizub on there? And so that's where that came from. So it all actually began right in your museum, and I remember that occasion quite fondly. Yes, tonight I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that are described in this new book called Lest They Forget. This is a collection of opinion editorials that I wrote over the course of many years as we articulated the Ukrainian Canadian community's position for acknowledgement and symbolic redress or recognition, whatever you'd like to call it, along with a longer essay where I sort of think back on everything that happened and what we succeeded with and what we failed at. Because again, any venture like this, organized by volunteers, carried on for well over 2 decades, is going to have its starts and fits, successes and failures. And let's be honest, it wasn't all a success. Although in the main, I'd like to say that I think that I and the people that I was associated with in the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association and other groups did achieve most of what we hoped to. That is, we managed to secure public recognition of Canada's first national internment operations through exhibits like the one that's now there at the museum. And I would certainly encourage you all to go to it in very short order. Looking at the panels, you can get a good idea of what happened to whom and why. But tonight, I'll try to summarize some of those things for you. And I'll do it as Dr. Budin pointed out, kind of from the inside. I'll tell you some of the funny stories because I think that's more interesting than just me sitting here and prattling on about all the historical details. How did I find out about it? Well, I was born in Kingston, Ontario, where I'm sitting right now. My parents came to Canada after the Second World War as political refugees, so-called DPs, part of that third wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada. They were a very political immigration. Their focus was on the liberation of Ukraine, on Ukraine's independence. They were very much focused on the old country. They had not come here as economic migrants. They had not come here to be settlers or colonialists. They had come here because this is where they found asylum as a result of the events of the Second World War. My mother being a slave laborer in Nazi Germany, my father being part of the Ukrainian underground resistance. You can't see it, but behind me, just about literally behind me, is the one piece of luggage they had with them when they got off the boat. And I see it every day when I come to my office, and it reminds me of what hard work and perseverance and commitment and the sense of community that they raised me with can achieve in a lifetime. Anyway, born in Kingston, I grew up in a city that has a great university, Queen's University, where I went, a military university where I now teach, the Royal Military College of Canada. Of course, many prisons. Kingston is the gulag of Canada, if you like, a military city, essentially a city of white-collar workers, let's be honest. In those days, there were some industries, but not many. I grew up in a very small Ukrainian Canadian community. Most of the people I knew were either displaced persons from the Second World War or their children. There were a few others who had come here before the Second World War. When it came to time for me to be doing graduate studies, I started out as a biologist, actually. But when I got to the master's level at Queen's in the Department of Geography, I grew increasingly interested in political geography and had as a supervisor Peter Goheen. Peter suggested that I do a historical geography of the Ukrainians in Kingston. I didn't want to. I clearly resisted the notion of studying my own. I thought it would be completely boring. I imagine that some of you feel the same way. Why would I study my community here in Saskatchewan or in Brandon or in Chicoutimi or in Amherst or in Belleville? what can I possibly say that's interesting about the people I grew up with? That was my feeling. I had visions of what I would like to do, and it certainly wasn't studying my own community. But in those days, when your supervisor told you what you were going to do, you did it. And so I began to go around the archives trying to see what I could find out. There wasn't very much. And so another professor in the history department, Richard Pierce, the late Richard Pierce, suggested I use oral history techniques. In other words, go out with a tape recorder, ask people, when did you arrive? Where did you work? Who did you know? Who else was here? What kind of activities did you involve yourselves with? And so on. So I began that. It's kind of interesting. I just talked first to my parents' generation, and then there were some people who'd come between the wars, the so-called second wave. And I remember always going to a place on Colburn Street in the north end of town, which is where sort of immigrant working class area was, Colburn Street, and talking to the widow of a veteran of the First World War, a woman by the name of Rosalie Kharitinyuk. Now, I'd gone there before, Christmas caroling, that sort of thing. I always thought she was a little weird, to tell you the truth. But I had to talk to people, and there she was. And so I set up an interview. I spent almost 7 hours with her. I left feeling, because I keep a diary, so I remember exactly what happened. I left feeling that I'd wasted my time, that I just sat there and listened to someone prattle on about all sorts of stuff that was of no interest to anybody. I couldn't have been more wrong. I couldn't have been more wrong. That lady, who I thought was just a little off, gave me the two best hints of my academic life, changed my whole life. I can't talk about the one story because that's what I did my PhD on and took me in a different way, but it was about a man from Peterson, Saskatchewan called Gordon Richard Bogdan Panchuk, who joined the RCAF and during and after the Second World War helped rescue the displaced persons, including my parents. I did my PhD and did a lot of work on those people, those Canadian Ukrainians who volunteered for service overseas during the Second World War. That's because Mrs. Kharitinyuk mentioned, maybe you want to talk to this guy, he's a teacher now in Montreal called Bogdan Panchuk. I'd never heard of him till she told me. I also asked her, well, was there anyone here in Kingston when you arrived in the interwar period? Someone here around First World War. She said, well, yeah, there was a guy called Nick Sokoluk. Nick Sokoluk. I'd never heard of him. Now, again, I grew up in Kingston. I was an altar boy. I went to a good high school. I went to a good university. And I knew the community. I'd never heard of Nick Sokoluk. My parents had never heard of Nick Sokoluk. I said to Mrs. Kharitinyuk, well, where is he? Is he still alive? Yeah, I think he is, she says. He was in the Pravoslavna Hromada. He moved from Kingston, and I think you'll find him in the St. Voldemar Cathedral on Bathurst Street, 400 Bathurst Street, I still remember, in Toronto. Well, in those days, we had things called phone books. So I looked up the Toronto phone book, and I found, there's the cathedral, 400 Bathurst Street, and there's a Sokoluk. So I phoned him up and I said, I'm from Kingston. Could I come up and visit you? I'd like to interview for my MA. And he said, sure. I went up. Now, I'll always remember the day. It was the 14th of February, 1978. And you may say, wow, that's pretty impressive. You'd remember that day. Well, the truth of it is that was, of course, Valentine's Day. And my girlfriend at the time was not very happy that I left her on Valentine's Day to go interview some old Ukrainian guy in Toronto. So I still remember the scars of that day many, many years ago, 46 years ago. Anyway, that's the truth of how I got to meet Nick Sokoluk. So I go up to Toronto and I sit down in his house, very modest house, and I'm asking him about his life. And I'm asking, where are you from? Bukovina, Pravoslavny, where did you arrive? I came to Canada in 1913. Where did you arrive? Montreal, what did you do? I worked in a foundry. Right. And I said, oh, well, okay, I heard you were in Kingston around the First World War. Yes, he says, I was in Kingston in the First World War. I said, oh, well, okay. When did you arrive? And he said, I think he said it was the 27th of October, 1914. I go, wow, that's pretty impressive. What a memory this man has. I said, you remember that date very well? He says, oh, I'll never forget it. And I said, well, okay, so you arrived in Kingston and you must have worked in the locomotive works or in the shipyards or very commonly in the Davis tannery, all, heavy labor industries. He said, no. And I said, oh, well, then further afield, maybe in Portsmouth, you were working in the grain elevators. No. I said, well, where were you working? He said, I was in Fort Henry. And I said, oh, Fort Henry. Of course, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Everybody knows it. It overlooks, it dominates the city of Kingston. I said, you must have been a stonemason repairing the fort because it had fallen into disrepair. He says, no, I was a prisoner. What? A prisoner? Well, first of all, it's a British fort. You don't think of it as a prison. I mean, I knew the prisons. Why would that be a prison? He says, no, I was an enemy young. I'd never heard of it. I was gobsmacked. As a little boy, I used to play up on Fort Henry Hill. We'd go up there after Služba Božja, after Divine Liturgy on the Sundays. Sometimes as a community, have picnics, spectacular view of the city, of the lake, of the St. Lawrence River, fresh air. The older folks would sit around, smoke cigarettes and talk, and the kids would play in the moats and run, all that kind of stuff. We had no one knew. No one knew. No one spoke about it. No one taught me about it. No one had ever said anything. I didn't even know what to ask him. So, I asked the obvious questions. Well, when did you arrive? What happened? Who was there? How many Ukrainians? And he told me as much as he could. And I was taping it all. And I came home and I thought, well, I got to look into this. So I went into the morgue, as it's called, of the Daily British Whig, the newspaper, one of Canada's oldest daily newspapers. And I started finding stuff. And I incorporated some of that into my MA thesis. And I put a little transcript of his testimony in there. And I thought, well, that's fascinating stuff. And I finished my MA, and I went out to the University of Alberta to do my PhD, and I went and studied that other area, Luciuk and the DPs and post-World War II immigration, the third wave of Ukrainians to Canada, and almost had sort of forgotten about the internment story. I thought, well, that was an interesting little episode. I've added some stuff. I published a little booklet about it. That's enough. But then things changed. In 1984, I graduated from the University of Alberta, and I came back to do a postdoctoral fellowship in Toronto at the University of Toronto in the Department of Geography. And just at that same time, a controversy erupted here in Canada about the alleged presence of thousands of Nazi war criminals in this country. A commission of inquiry was established under the leadership of the late now Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes, the Deschênes Commission. And for 2 or 3 years, there was a very unpleasant, controversial argument in Canada about whether or not the Ukrainian and Baltic diasporas were actually consciously or otherwise hiding Nazis in our midst, people who'd come in the third wave. Community turned to me and said, well, you just written your PhD about it. Why don't you be one of our spokespeople? And so something called the Civil Liberties Commission was established in associationship with the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, now the Congress, but kind of independent of it, under the leadership of a man called John Grigorovich. And we dealt with that fake news, frankly, of thousands of Nazis being here. That was complete Soviet era fabrication. It still gets regurgitated by the Russian Federation and its fellow travelers in the West, but we dealt with that, we thought, at the time. We didn't, but we thought. Just as we were ending our work there, another issue emerged, and that was our fellow Japanese Canadians had articulated their experience in the Second World War, and they had been pressing the government for some kind of compensation and apology. The same thing was happening in the United States, and indeed, President Ronald Reagan did apologize to Japanese Americans, and our Prime Minister Mulroney at the time did the same thing, or was planning to do the same thing, with the National Association of Japanese Canadians. Well, I said, that's a precedent. So now if you'll show slide 1, you'll see in a minute, and we'll have him circled for you, Nick Sokoliuk. So this is actually Nick Sokoliuk, the man with the mustache there. His friend has got his hand on his shoulder. That's Nick Sokoliuk in Fort Henry, in one of the casemates. If we look at slide number 2, here's what he told me about. He told me about how thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans were rounded up and put behind Canadian barbed wire. And here's a great example of what that looked like. These are men who were rounded up and held at Castle Mountain in what is now Banff National Park. I love this photograph because if you look at it, there's one man just to the left, if you're thinking where he was standing, of that center post. He's got his hands on his hips. He looks angry. He looks defiant. I always call him Mr. Defiant. He looks like, Figus Macum, he's angry. Man beside him to his right has got his hands on his face like this, as if he's ashamed at hiding. A lot of these men are looking away from the camera, which is unusual. They don't seem to want to be photographed. Some are looking, but only one is defiant and one is almost embarrassed, and the others are indifferent or just don't want to be remembered. And yet this is what it was like. Thousands of men and some women and children rounded up and put in 24 internment camps across the country. And as I studied this subject, I realized that this was coast to coast. There were camps in every province, half in what you might call Western Canada and half in central Eastern Canada. In your province where you are now, there was a small camp established just toward the end of the war from 13th of October, as I recall, 1918 to early March of 1919. Munson, Alberta and Eaton, Saskatchewan were linked by a railway track, and there were railway cars where they held some men. And my colleague Bohdan Kodan at the University of Saskatchewan played an instrumental role in putting up a permanent exhibit there. So, you know, kudos to him. You can actually go in Saskatchewan and see something about this story beyond the temporary museum exhibit that's there now at the museum. Anyway, thousands of Ukrainians and other Europeans rounded up, forced to do heavy labor for the profit of their jailers. What little wealth they had was confiscated. Some of it would be returned, but not all of it. They suffered a whole series of state-sanctioned indignities. I don't want to list them all, but things like restrictions on their freedom of association, freedom of movement, censorship. During the final stages of the war and after the war's end, some of them were deported. They were stripped of their right to vote in 1917. So the first act that was used against them was a War Measures Act that was the very same legislation used against our fellow Japanese Canadians, Germans, and Italians in World War II, against some Quebecois in 1970, which some of you may remember. And then again, when it was redone and turned into the Emergencies Act, was used just a few months ago against the truck convoy. You know, I mean, whether you're pro or con that, the reality of it is, in the 20th century, there were three occasions: World War I first, against Ukrainians and other Europeans; World War II, Japanese, Italian, German, some Jewish Canadians; Quebecois in 1970. Three times the War Measures Act was used to suspend civil liberties and human rights in this country. First against us. And that's what everyone forgot. And Mary Monko, who we'll talk about later, speaks to that. Now, in 1917, further indignity. You lose the right to vote. If you arrived after 1904, you could not vote in the 1917 election because of the Wartime Elections Act, which basically stripped enemy aliens of the right to protest what was being done to them by voting in a different government. So the Borden government made sure they couldn't vote, and then very cleverly, ladies, I'm sorry, gave the right to vote to some women, the wives and daughters of men serving in the Canadian Expeditionary Force overseas. So in a way, 1917 is an important moment in Canadian democratic history. Some women got the right to vote, but at the same time, the very same election, a large number of people who'd done no wrong were stripped of the right to vote. Let's not forget that. So a whole huge injustice was done to a large number of people, about 8,500 physically interned in 24 camps, and another 80,000 or so registered as enemy aliens and forced to report regularly to the authorities. So this is a crippling legacy for the Ukrainian Canadian community, no doubt about it. And it had consequences going forward that I can't discuss in the short time we have, but you can read about them. So you have internment operations, you have disenfranchisement, confiscation of property, restrictions on freedom of association and movement and all that kind of stuff. And the internment operations don't end with the end of the First World War. We all know the 11th of November, 1918, the armistice is signed. We still recall it every year at Remembrance Day. I still encourage people to go to Remembrance Day ceremonies and remember the sacrifices and the service of those tens of hundreds of thousands of men and women who served in Canada's wars. But the internment operations didn't end. Because of the Bolshevik coup d'etat, of the collapse of the Tsarist Russian Empire, and later the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, there was fear of dangerous foreigners, of radical aliens, the Winnipeg General Strike, and so on. And so the internment operations actually continued until June of 1920. June of 1920. That's when the last camps were closed. Now, all of this history, as I say, I first heard in bits and pieces from Luciuk, and then literally did some more research. As 1987, 88 was coming along, I mentioned a moment ago, the National Association of Japanese Canadians was articulating its claim for some kind of redress, compensation, and apology. They got it from Mr. Mulroney, acting, I think, as a reflection of what President Reagan did in the United States. They sort of, shared a philosophical point of view. And I said, well, wait a minute, this establishes a legal and a moral precedent. And so the Civil Liberties Commission took on the notion, thanks to John Gregorovich, of saying the Ukrainian Canadian community deserves something similar. And Dr. Cordon, again, who I've mentioned already, and I co-authored a piece that was published in the Globe and Mail, said, and who says time heals all, in 1988. And we had a meeting with the then Minister of Multiculturalism, Jerry Weiner, in Montreal. John Gregorovich was there, I was there, Baudin was there. And Mr. Weiner, the Minister of Multiculturalism in Canada, sitting as close as, well, I am to you, as it were, said it never happened. What? It never happened? Now, we pushed back very hard against this denial. And within fairly short order, the government changed its tune. And the government said, well, yes, it happened. Why don't you just forget about it? We said, well, wait a minute. Why should we forget about it when that's not the position you took with Japanese Canadians? You didn't tell them to go forget about it. You didn't say to the Miki brothers, forget about it. And they said, well, it's different. I said, how is it different? And they couldn't explain that. And they said, look, we don't want to open the door because it'll Pandora's box. If we apologize or offer you compensation, all sorts of other groups will come out. And I go, well, good. Like, what? So you're going to say it's okay to have some kind of settlement with this community, a racialized community, I guess, if you're talking about Japanese Canadians, but not Ukrainians? And I pointed out that in those days, Ukrainians were not considered to be white, right? So, and that's not semantic. You can look at the letters to the editors and stuff like this. We were bohunks. There was all sorts of stuff. We were interned because we had come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so we came with passports that said we were citizens of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But many people at the time said, no, I'm not an Austrian or Hungarian. I'm a Ukrainian. I'm something, or a Croatian or a Serb. I'm not sympathetic to the Austro-Hungarian Empire's war aims, and yet they rounded them up. The British Foreign Office said to Canada, this was the mother country telling Canada, the Dominion, these people are friendly aliens, and yet they still rounded them up and still did all this stuff. So what informed the internment operations? Well, on the legal level, well, these were citizens of an enemy state, yes, but they were doing no wrong. There's never been any evidence of any of them doing any wrong. And yet they were rounded up, registered, confined, stripped of property, all these things that I've already mentioned. And I said, so there should be something similar. And we at first, we didn't know what to ask for. We said some research funds and so on, so we could do more work and find out, what the whole story was. By then, of course, very, very few survivors left. But the government resisted. And it didn't matter. I'm not trying to be mean here to liberals or conservatives. The bureaucracy stayed more or less the same. And for almost 20 years, we got the same story. Why don't you forget it? Why don't you, work with other groups and we'll give some kind of omnibus, statement. And we said, no, look, each community should have the opportunity to present its case, to be heard, fairly heard, and then you resolve it. We don't think there are going to be dozens or hundreds. We think there may be 3 or 4 or 5, and that's exactly what happened. Chinese Canadians for the head tax, our good friend Inky Mark, the best friend the Ukrainian Canadian community ever had in the House of Commons, was a Reform Alliance Chinese Canadian whose family paid the head tax and who got behind us and helped us get Bill C-331, which was a legislation that helped us solve our problem and get the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund set up. This was great. To me, this made me so proud as a Canadian that I, as someone born of Ukrainian heritage, could be working with a Chinese Canadian in the Reform Alliance movement, and I'm far from that. And yet we worked together because it was the right thing to do. And yet pushback. It didn't matter whether it was Jean Chrétien or Paul Martin or Mr. Harper, they all, to greater or lesser degrees, were indifferent or ignorant or even opposed to this. But when we got that bill passed, then we began to deal. And then we met some very serious people, Sheila Copps from the Liberals, Jason Kennedy from the Conservatives. But, I'm not going to get into politics. I don't know any of these people who are online here, but like them or don't like them, I'll tell you both those people were intelligent, hardworking, fully briefed, well comprehended the issues, and dealt with us hard. Good conversations, good negotiations, and with my colleagues, Paul Grod, who was then the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Andrew Hladishevsky, a lawyer representing the Shevchenko Foundation from Edmonton, and I from the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, we eventually negotiated a settlement. That came only in 2008. Between the sort of early mid-80s and 2008, almost 2 decades, during which we did all sorts of things to tell the story. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see one of the things we did. It was one of my favorite projects. This was placing a statue by the now late, unfortunately, John Boxtel, a Dutch-Canadian sculptor. And we put this statue of a mother and her swaddled child and her little girl at Spirit Lake, which is in the Abitibi region of Quebec. It's one of the 2 camps where there were women and children held. It still stands there today. I called this statue Interned Madonna, and I still love it. I mean, to me, its location and where these people were, this was in the back end of nowhere. If you want to get to Spirit Lake today, you get in your car in Montreal, hard 7-hour drive to get there. It was one of 2 experimental farms. The other one was at Kapuskasing in Ontario, where they tried to cut away the forest, develop the clay belt so that there could be farming communities that would provide food for the foresters and the mine workers and so on. And in this case, women and children were held there. Now, we've done many plaques, statues, books were published, and so on to try to sort of tell the story. What was our core message? And this is the thing I really want a lot of you to hear. We live in a society where there have been many apologies to many different communities, restitution, reparation, reconciliation. We've heard these phrases. How did we shape our campaign? Well, we did it very simply. After Bogdan Kordan and I published that article in the Globe and Mail, 1988, a few months later, as I recall, I got a phone call from a man in Toronto who said to me he'd been approached by a woman in Hamilton, Ontario, about 3 hours west of where I live, and that this woman had said she wanted to talk to me. And I said, why? Well, she read your article in the Globe and Mail, and she has something to tell you. So I called her up. Her name was Mary Manco Haskett. And Mary, when I spoke to her, said, I was a child and I was interned with my parents and siblings in Spirit Lake. I was born in Montreal, so this is a Canadian-born child, not a foreigner, not an immigrant, right? Not an enemy alien, but because she was born to parents who had come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, she and the entire family were moved to Spirit Lake, where her sister Nellie died. We still don't know where Nellie's buried, by the way. People did die in the camps in the First World War. Some shot trying to escape, some from diseases and so on. Some going insane and simply being buried, frankly, in unmarked graves. This happened. Mary says, can you come talk to me? I said, sure. And I drove down. And the first time I met her, I was with Alexandra Hitchi, who is now the president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, doing a great job of it, I might add. And we went down and I said to Mary, well, tell me your story. Why do you want to see me? What's so special about what we wrote? She says, look, I was born in Canada. We were interned. Then we were released. My parents lost everything they had. They had a little green grocery shop in Montreal. They lost it. It was confiscated. They didn't get it back. They lost their daughter. They were so discouraged that they actually said, we're out of here. And they left Canada and they went back to Western Ukraine, then under Polish occupation. And they stayed there until about 37, 38. And then they realized, there's another war coming. We're out of here. And they came back to Canada. And then Mary, lived a normal life, married a non-Ukrainian. Mary Manko Haskett is her maiden, it was her married name. Manko is her maiden name. And she said, I raised a family. And like any mother, some of you listening in, she tried to tell her children about her experiences. And she said, we were interned in Spirit Lake. It was hard. I lost my sister. You lost an aunt. So she's telling her kids this, and they go, Mom, that's never happened. How could it have happened? We would have learned about it in school. You must be thinking something that happened in the old country, because that was tough over there. We know that. And maybe you're confusing things. She said, no. It happened in Canada. It's Spirit Lake. That's where we were held. Well, good kids. They weren't bad kids. They said, okay, Mom, here's an atlas of Canada. For those of you who don't know, an atlas is a book with map plates in it. They opened the atlas and they said, here's Quebec. Okay, here's Montreal. Here's Quebec City. Here's the St. Lawrence River. Here's the Abitibi region. Where's Spirit Lake? Mary looks and looks and looks and looks and can't find it. And she says, I can't find it. Well, see, Mom, it's not really there. She didn't know they changed the name to Lake Beauchamp. The name was changed. And so Mary's own children did not believe their mother, whom they loved, because there was no evidence. They hadn't studied it. They hadn't heard it. They couldn't find it. And then Bogdan Kordan and I wrote the op-ed. It was published. She found me. I said to her kids, yeah, this happened. And in fact, Fran Haskett became an early member of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association negotiating team as an attorney descendant representative to help us articulate what we wanted to do. So that was good. Mary was happy. And I said, well, we're thinking of having a campaign, something acknowledgement and redress. What do you think? I'll never forget. Again, here's one of these little old ladies that seemingly have come into my life. Thank God, and I don't mind saying that, this is good fate, who said, Lubomyr, if you're going to organize a campaign on this issue, and I said, yeah, I think we might. So what do you want? You want compensation like, the Japanese are getting individual compensation and apology in the House of Commons. You want that? She says, no, Lubomyr, if you do this, please, I shouldn't use the word, but here she said what I want. I could say prescription that Mary gave me, but really she didn't put it that way. She said, here's what I want. Your campaign should be about memory, not money. Wow. That's it. She's got me as her knight for the day I die. I thought to myself, what a remarkable, remarkable woman who isn't here saying, give me an apology, give me money, I'm suffering, I suffered, this, that, pay me off, pay me off. She said, memory. She said, if only people had remembered what happened to my family and me, maybe it wouldn't have happened or wouldn't have been as bad in the Second World War with the Japanese, German, and Italian Canadians, who she remembered very well. Or what happened in Quebec. She was born in Cowansville, in Montreal. She knew that world. She said, maybe these things wouldn't have happened or would have been somehow ameliorated if people had only remembered what happened to us. And I said, God love you. I'll fight this one and we will win. And we did. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a place called Stanley Barracks. Oh, sorry. That's Mary Manko, I should point out right there in the middle. That's me as a much younger man with more hair. And on the other side is John Gregorovich. This was when we were actually in the House of Commons in 1993. We were visiting the House of Commons, trying to meet with one of the ministers. That was at the time Sheila Feinstone, as I recall, who claimed she couldn't see us because she wasn't in Ottawa. And just as this picture was being taken, who walks out the side door of the House of Commons but Sheila Feinstone? So she was there. She doesn't want to meet us. She didn't want to hear from the survivor. But nevertheless, we persisted. And eventually, thanks to the good work of Paul Grod, president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Andrew Hladishevsky from the Shevchenko Foundation from Winnipeg. He's in Edmonton, but the foundation's in Winnipeg. In 2008, as you see in the next slide, we went to a place called Stanley Barracks, and here's what Stanley Barracks looked like in 1914, internees behind barbed wire. If you say, well, where's Stanley Barracks now? Probably many of you have heard of the CNE exhibition in Toronto. So if you're at the CNE, guess what? You're walking in an internment camp, a receiving station from where men were then shifted to other camps around the country, including Kapuskasing. My daughter, Cassandra Luciuk, has done a graphic novel based on the diary of one of these men, a guy probably called John Boyko, who was at Stanley Barracks and later sent to different camps. We chose that as a place where we met with Jason Kenney, who you may remember as a former member of the federal government and then as the premier of Alberta. And we signed an agreement. And the next slide shows you really what it looked like in 2008 when we signed an agreement establishing the Canadian First World War Interment Recognition Fund. Now, the fund was established with a 15-year mandate. It was established with a $10 million endowment. The $10 million could not be tapped into. You couldn't touch the capital. The interest earned on that $10 million was to be used for commemorative and educational projects for a 15-year period. So the fund came to an end in 2023 and is now reverted to the Shevchenko Foundation. It's still held as a separate endowment. So if any of you are interested because of family connections or genealogical connections or whatever interest you have, you can apply to the Shevchenko Foundation to this fund and perhaps get some funding. For 15 years, we had a mandate to sustain projects that would commemorate and educate our fellow Canadians about what happened. So we, for example, supported lesson plans for school teachers in every province of the country, free of charge. We put up statues and plaques. It's free of, across the country, including the one in Saskatchewan was funded in part by the Endowment Council. We paid for research and books. So Professor Cordon wrote a very important book called No Free Men on exactly this subject. It's an academic book, but for those who want that solid research, there it is. Films by people like Ryan Boyko, the exhibit, Enemy Alien, another exhibit called Lost Liberties that was at the Canadian Museum of History and is now also touring Canada. And I would encourage you to bring it to Saskatchewan eventually. It's a different kind of exhibit that compares the First and Second World War with the Quebec crisis, compares all three, takes that comparative perspective and opens up the story of human rights, civil liberties in times of domestic and international crisis and makes it comparative. Because again, I know that most of you online are of Ukrainian heritage, perhaps all of you. So who cares about us, right? If it's just me, right? But if you say to your fellow Italian Canadian or German Canadian or Croatian Canadian or French Canadian, you say, this act, the War Measures Act, was used not just against us and some other East Europeans, but against Turks, against Jews, against Italians, against Germans, and against Quebecois, then that's actually most of us. Right? And then it becomes a story of civil liberties and human rights and how we have to stand in defense of those, have to remain eternally vigilant to make sure that our rights aren't compromised when there are periods of domestic and international crisis. And think of 9/11. Suddenly Muslims felt themselves targeted, right? Well, there's a terrorist attack and suddenly that community's to blame. People say we have to learn history so you don't, repeat the mistakes. Then there's the other view that says what we learn from history, we learn nothing from history. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think that we as a society can incrementally learn and we can get and are getting better, despite everything everyone tells you. Things are actually better than they ever have been before in human history. But it's slow. It isn't always as remarkable as you'd like it to be. In this case, we were able, through hard work on the part, not just of me. I mean, I might be the grandfather of this thing, but there were a whole bunch of other people who got involved. And over decades of work, we were able to tell the story We were able to get it into the schools, onto films, in plaques and markers across the country, through plays, through artwork, some of it better than others, and again, that's the kind of thing that, we can all argue till the cows come home. The bottom line is there still is a fund. It's now in the Shevchenko Foundation. Any Canadian can apply to it. Before those 15 years of the endowment fund, it was a very inclusive endowment council. We had representatives from the Croatian and Serbian and Polish and German communities. We had, input. We sought input from all different ethnocultural communities that were affected by the internment operations. Now that 10 million is held within the Ukrainian community. So again, from that little old lady on Colburn Street who told me a name, to Nick Sokoluk, who you've seen, to Mary Monko, the work we did enriched the Ukrainian Canadian community by $10 million forever. Forever. And that resource can now be used to articulate various other related issues having to do with civil liberties and human rights. You know what? At the end of the day, I feel pretty proud of that. So, thank you for your attention. I'll be very happy to take any questions you may have.